Good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. We'll have our second webinar in the series of 4 Resilient Cities webinars being organized by both UNISDR, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and CIB, the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction. And we have 4 of those. What we had yesterday, that was on enabling risk reduction through urban planning. And we talked a lot in our presentations and the discussions afterward in questions and answers on how to engage stakeholders, how to organize the process, how to engage informal settlements, all of it, the role of regulatory systems, for example. We build on that and dig deeper in the engagement of multiple stakeholders that we all know is of extreme importance. And in that context, we will focus on questions like the role of the private sector and local business, the role of NGOs, and the main barriers to including those and others, and how to overcome them. We'll see some good practices. We will talk about how construction professionals can or should play a role or a proactive role. We talk about the difference between the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, or the combination, or one being necessary for the other. And in the end, we will talk about the need for research, as the outcome of these webinars are to lead into a joint ISDR CIB research roadmap. To do that, this webinar and the other 2 webinars will be recorded. It's a series. We will inform all panelists and all attendees where to find those recordings so they can see them again or can forward information on how to their own. For today, the program after this introduction is that we have the 4 speakers as in the brochure with the program. Lee Bosch, Marla Petal, Daniel MC, and Rohit Yasu, if I pronounce that correctly. Afterwards, we will have a question and answer session. Let me give you information on question and answers. During the presentation, all attendees can submit questions. You see part of a screenshot of the event center that you all see. At the bottom, you can select Send to Me and the question. And by simply hitting the return button, it will be submitted. I keep track of all those questions. And either immediately after the presentation or preferably at the end of the webinar, we will have a questions and answer session. I will select questions, I will read them to the presenters, and I will ask a selected presenter to respond. If your name and organization and country to be mentioned, mention those in your question, otherwise I won't know. If you want your question to be addressed to a certain speaker, mention the name of the speaker, otherwise we won't know. After introduction, I want to introduce our first speaker, Lee Bosch, Loughborough University in the UK. He, among many other positions, is a joint coordinator of the CIB Commission Task Group 63 on disasters in the built environment. The task group that with CIB is the platform for having all of this organized. And his presentation will be about how to make cities more resilient through a multi-stakeholder top-down approach as experienced in the UK. Lee, I will make you the presenter so that you are able to share your desktop, open your presentation, and us to enjoy listening to it.
Thank you, Wim. Thank you, Wim, for that very nice introduction, and thank you to everyone who has sort of tuned to this webinar. We've got, as well as me, we've got 3 excellent speakers as well, so hopefully you'll find it very useful. Before we go on to my talk, we just wanted, as Cassidy did yesterday, just to remind everyone of the planned outputs from this webinar series, that the webinars will be publicly available on the CIB and UNISDR websites, Also, the plan is that the inputs to these webinars will contribute towards the CIB research roadmap, outlining key areas for research related to hazards in the built environment, and all this will be presented at the CIB World Congress in Brisbane next May in Australia. Also, as part of that, there will be a special session, conference session, and there's a call for papers out at the moment focused on increasing the resilience of cities. And so the outputs of these webinars will contribute towards the first report of the UNISDR's Making Cities Resilient campaign, and that's something that Cassidy Johnson, who's co-coordinator of the task group, is involved with. Right, with no further ado, the title of my talk, about 15 minutes, is Making Cities Resilient, a top-down multi-stakeholder approach from the United Kingdom. As you can see there, I'm Lee Boda. I'm a lecturer in disaster risk reduction at the Water Engineering and Development Centre, WEDEC at University. The of this talk is perhaps a little bit different to what I would normally talk about. I very much advocate grassroots, community-based approaches to disaster risk reduction, but I believe that those approaches should be supported with governmental or top-down frameworks as well, which actually encourage the grassroots-based work. Therefore, based on the research I've done in the UK and also in other parts of the world, I actually thought there's some work going on in the UK, there's actually an act in the UK which might provide quite a good framework, which, although very much focused on the UK, could provide some interesting lessons for other parts of the world. The photograph that you can see is a photograph of the town of Carlisle, or the city of Carlisle in North West. I'll come to that at the end of my talk. Very briefly, the things that I'm going to cover in this talk is very brief information of the UK context, what the hazards and threats are. I'll again briefly introduce the Civil Contingencies Act, which was made an act in 2004, and I believe is a framework for supporting locally relevant actions in relation to resilience building and disaster risk reduction. What are stakeholder inputs, how stakeholders can get involved, who the stakeholders are, and when their inputs should optimally be made. And just a few final thoughts, which hopefully I'm sure some of the following speakers, Marla, Daniel and Rohit, may even be able to answer in their discussions. So the context in the UK. Generally, the UK has not a history of large-scale disasters. The climate is typically rather benign. I mean, this is in relative terms compared to the large-scale windstorms and hurricanes and floods that affect many parts of the world. We do have floods, but they tend not to be on the scale that you find in other parts of the world. We don't really have an earthquake problem or volcano problem in the UK, but we have some hazards, and they do have some impacts on people and particularly the economy. Main natural hazards are coastal flooding, inland flooding, windstorms and extreme temperatures, so very cold or very hot, or in the case of the UK, a little bit cold or a little bit hot seem to have big impacts on the UK. These hazards and threats, which are listed here, are determined by the annual risk assessment, which is undertaken by the government on an annual basis. So we've got natural hazards and the human threats, which include things such as terrorism, crime and industrial incidents. So that context, in spite of the fact that in the UK we tend not to be affected by massive scale or scale disasters, we do have a framework in place which helps us to cope with such things, and that is the Civil Contingencies Act. The Civil Contingencies Act was actually in response to what is known as the 4 Fs, which were floods in 2000, fuel blockages in 2000, something called foot-and-mouth disease, which affected livestock in 2001, and also some strikes by the fire services in 2002 and 2003. They're what referred to as the 4 Fs. And those 4 Fs sort of prompted the government to look at the what was then sort of civil protection measures that were in place, and the Act and the accompanying regulations presented here were an attempt to deliver a single framework for civil protection in the United Kingdom to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The Act is separated into two substantive parts: the law arrangements for civil protection, as it's called, in Part 1, and Part 2 is made up of emergency powers. And the objective of the Civil Contingencies Act was to modernise outdated legislation. Now, that's all useful context, but what's particularly important, I feel, about the Act is a requirement to proactively identify key stakeholders, or as they're termed in the Act, responders. And I will give some examples of who those key stakeholders or responders are in following slides. It's also worth bearing in mind that the Act is currently under review, so it may change to some extent. I think the rest of the Act will be pretty much the same. These webinars are supported by the UNISDR. I actually thought it might be quite useful very quickly to actually look at the Making Cities Resilient campaign and the 10-point essential checklist, which is listed in this table on the left. And in the right-hand column are the aspects of that checklist which I believe, and also from talking to some of my engineering students and some emergency planners, are covered or encompassed by the Civil Contingencies Act. So things such as putting in place organisation and coordination for dealing with, for increasing resilience or dealing with emergencies and disasters, finding a budget for that type of work, preparing risk assessments, etc. The Act covers those things directly, and that's where the Y is indicated, but also some other things such as maintaining critical infrastructure and assessing the safety of schools and health facilities are covered by the Act indirectly. For example, by some of the stakeholders which the Act sort of brings on board, and I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slides. Just to go over that one, the key message is that the Civil Contingencies Act, what it espouses, are very much in line with a lot of the requirements of the 10-point checklist for the Making Cities Resilient campaign. Although, in spite of that, it's perhaps a surprise only. I think I checked today, only one UK city has actually signed up to that campaign, and that's Stoke-upon-Trent. Right, so how does the Act actually work? This diagram is a little bit dated now. Since what it shows is the national level at the top, the national bodies who have actually written the Act, the regional level, which now, since the new government came in 2010, has pretty much been removed. But what's of particular importance for my talk is the local level. In particular, what I know as these local resilience forums. Local resilience forums were established to maintain effective multi-agency arrangements to respond to major emergencies. They're very much about response. Also, to minimise the impact of those emergencies on the public, on property, and on the environment. So although the Act is very much or phrased in terms of responding and what should we do when something bad happens, there are mechanisms in there to support sort of proactive work. Now, the local resilience forums work are the inputs of these, what are known as Category 1 and Category 2 responders, in inverted commas. I'll call them stakeholders or actors, but the Act refers to them as responders. Or they are more than responders. Responders sort of indicates that is very about reacting, but actually doing a lot of proactive work up front. And that can include things such as emergency preparedness, but also hazard mitigation. And I'll explain what some of those responders are next. What this framework actually puts in place is it recognises the need for local solutions to problems using local stakeholders. And those stakeholders can be public and private. Who are these stakeholders? Who are these responders? In essence, they're local authorities, they're the local councils. And local authorities and local councils have a number of representatives involved with things such as emergency planning, but importantly, urban planning. Cassidy Johnson said yesterday, in most global cities, planning is not very well integrated with risk management and emergency planning. So this framework, the Civil Contingencies Act, actually provides a forum through the Local Resilience Forum for local authority urban planners to actually speak to emergency planners and a wider range of other stakeholders. Stakeholders include national and government agencies and the non-governmental agencies, the emergency services, police, fire, ambulance and the like, coastal rescue, search and rescue services. Importantly, also utility companies. In the UK, this basically means the private sector, and those could be energy providers. They could be people who look after and maintain a national grid, water and sewage providers, communications providers, but also operating companies and those who maintain the transport infrastructure, such as roads and rail. And implicit within all these categories are construction professionals. And again, I will give you some examples of who they are later. This is indicative of the types of stakeholders who are represented in local resilience forums. For example, the local police. Actually, the local resilience forums are actually covered by the local police force constabulary sort of makeup. Local police who may chair these forums, emergency planners from the local authorities who may also chair these forums, planners, engineers, municipal engineers, environment agency, the emergency services or representatives from the emergency services, development agencies, health department in the UK, the National Health Service, companies and operators, the Chamber of Commerce who represent the needs and requirements of local businesses, highways and transport agencies, local water utilities, local utilities such as water and energy, but also within that are community groups. And the inputs of those sort of community groups will very much be dependent on what type of issues need to be discussed. So this is just an example. For example, if the brand new housing development which needs to be built or rebuilt in a town in the UK, the Local Resilience Forum can meet to discuss what the implications of that new development will be on emergency planning, on the requirements for school numbers, on the impact on health, on whether it has an impact on land drainage and various other things. So it could potentially be a very good forum for dealing with resilience in cities. Now, there's a key CIB related aspect to these webinars. I did want to particularly pull out some of the inputs from construction professionals. What this table shows are a list of construction-related and non-construction-related stakeholders. Along the top, based on the Royal Institution of British Architects Plan of Work, so pre-project, pre-construction, construction and post-completion phases. This is based on some research we did a few years ago with a wide range of stakeholders, trying to find out when the optimal inputs from these stakeholders should be in relation to disaster risk reduction, reducing the chance of disasters occurring from natural hazards and human-induced threats in the United Kingdom. And as you can see, key is whether it be architects, civil engineers, clients, developers, emergency risk managers, engineering consultants, utilities companies, the key area that their inputs need to be made are pre-construction stage. For urban planners and designers, it's clearly in the project phases. But this is particularly important. When we spoke to people, when their inputs were actually being made on development projects in relation to disaster risk reduction, it tended to be in the construction phase or even in the post-completion phase, which tends to be too late because then you talk about retrofitting rather than designing it. That's just an example of the wide range of stakeholders and when their inputs could and should be made.
Are you able to finish in 2 to 3 minutes?
Yes, yeah, I'm nearly finished now.
Thank you.
And if they're brought in too late, or if you're talking about existing developments, then obviously you've got this change of use stage at the end when some of these stakeholders have key inputs. Some final thoughts. As I said, I'm very much supportive of grassroots community-based approaches to dealing with disaster risk reduction and increasing resilience. However, I think those initiatives should be supported by some appropriate top-down frameworks, and this might be an example of that. Is a top-down framework really needed? And probably Marla or Rohit or Daniel might be able to provide some examples of whether that's this or not. Is the problem actually more about applying existing knowledge rather than generating new knowledge per se? So do we need to get a clearer idea of who these stakeholders and decision makers are? And ideally, the key question is how can we achieve joined up thinking and convert that joined up thinking into joined up actions? Okay, this is my last slide, just to give you, before I finish, a little bit of context to the Carlisle January 2004 floods. In this picture is the city offices, which included a lot of the social support services, the council offices, the emergency planning offices. Over the road were the police station, the ambulance station and the fire station, all flooded, all in the flown area and all flooded, and also nearby was an electricity substation which was taken out of action. It was located in a flood-prone area and also flooded. So what this was through a lack of joined-up thinking and a lack of thought that this situation was actually a disaster within a disaster. The people whose houses were flooded were then need support services which could not respond. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next presentation shows a nice example of how things can be organized, or maybe should be organized. If you stop sharing your desktop, I can make the next presenter, Marla Petol, a presenter. But while I'm doing so, I have an announcement for the attendees. We have at this moment approximately 800, a bit over 800 people who registered for those seminars. Lee mentioned that ISDR and CIB in, say, the coming half year will be producing a research roadmap on this very topic. We will make that available to all 800 participants by sending them an email on where to download this. Let's see whether... No, I'm still not a presenter. Lee, can you make me the presenter for this?
Yeah.
This next part.
Right.
I now am. Thanks. Okay. If everyone's my screen, the next speaker is Dr. Marla from the organization Save the Children in Australia. She will be talking about disaster resilient construction involving decision makers. Now more for the bottom up. Not as opposed to Lee was saying, but as her experience which she will be sharing. Marla, I will make you the presenter. So you can start sharing your screen or your desktop and open your presentation. Excellent.
Okay, and does it look good to go? Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this, and I'm fascinated by Lee's top-down approach, and hoping that as we put all the pieces together, we'll see how this applies in different settings. I'm going to take a look at the great big challenge of who all of the stakeholders might be, and see how they fit into a universal risk reduction framework. Moving from what we already have, which I'm calling a plan in practice. In other words, if he's ever consciously set about to do disaster risk reduction, they've nevertheless been doing something. And so I'm called plan in practice, and seeing if we can transition that to a conscious plan. And then moving beyond tokenism involving children and youth. So we frequently say that disaster risk reduction is everybody's business. And so when you enter the urban environment, of course, the everybody is just this, massive group of people. And how do we start to make sense of whether it's 1 million or 10 million? Of course, it helps the sociological literature often divide us into the micro, which is all the citizenry, the individuals, families, and households. Meso, which we organize ourselves socially, really, in neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, civic organizations, and businesses, at policy level where, national, regional, and local decisions are made collectively. And so that, I think, helps us to conceptualize the issue of urban stakeholders. At the micro level, of course, we're talking about the individuals, and at the macro level, we're talking about policymakers in various settings, and Lee's example were the local council especially. And the place where it gets perhaps the most diverse and challenging is the meso level, where we're talking about public agencies, academic and scientific institutions, organizations of many different kinds, businesses, opinion leaders rely upon, and of course international organizations come into that picture as well. And I mean, we can get into further detail on these meso organizations. I'll come to how we a sort of laundry list of them a bit. The other sort of theoretical frame I'd like to give this is to our disaster mitigation tasks in terms of these three parts. And this is kind of borne out by the research literature on both urban planning as well as household and organizational adaptation to disaster risk reduction. The first is assessment and planning. And I always present those as though they were one word, because we see clearly that doing assessment without planning or doing planning without assessment gives no valuable results. Unfortunately, it's often the case that assessment and planning are taken by different groups of people, and they don't often come together very nicely. So I think by putting them together, we start to put the onus on making that part of the same process. The area is physical protection. Sometimes I'd refer to this as physical environmental protection. This is really where the nitty-gritty of disaster risk reduction takes place, and I'll go into a bit more detail on that. And then the third area is response capacity development. Generally, like to think of that as the plan that we put in place because our physical and environmental protection measures are usually insufficient. And so that's really just to pick up the slack of where we have so far failed in physical and environmental protection. The advantage of this particular framework is that it works at the micro, meso, and macro level. And because I come from a grassroots community organization background, I'm frequently challenged by the general public. The general public doesn't usually like to hear a list of prescriptive things that they are supposed to do. They don't mind being part of the whole picture. But what we frequently do when we speak to the public is we give them a laundry list of things that they should do. I like to put it in terms of we all doing all of these things. We're doing assessment and planning, we're doing the physical and environmental protection, and we're developing the response capacity. We're doing it at home and in our families, at school or at work or in our neighborhoods or at the policy level, at any of our policy levels. I think that helping all of our stakeholders to understand this, we give greater depth of meaning to disaster risk reduction as everybody's business. Be able to go into these details, but you can look at this later on. In review of the literature, particularly the urban planning literature on disaster risk reduction, we can see that there are activities in assessment and planning that take place at the micro, meso, and macro level, and these are very familiar activities to all of us. It's just to kind of reinforce the value of this particular framework. That happens when it comes to physical protection, there are things to be done at each level with response capacity development. So I think it's probably familiar to most of our listeners, so I'm not going to go into any of those details. But I'm going to give you an example of where we tried to put this framework into practice in the Central Asia Earthquake Safety Initiative. And this is something that I did prior to my work with Save the Children Australia. So I'm going to just give you a bit of information about this Geohazards International and USAID project that was conducted with a large group of government and NGO partners in Central Asia between 2003 and 2004. The first thing that we did was to go in and to collect baseline data from a huge variety of stakeholders. This was, in a sense, a due diligence and research phase, document collection review, structured interviews and questionnaires for key informants, brief surveys, small group stakeholder meetings amongst people who were familiar with one another, some of the different stakeholder groups that I talked about, some studies and some direct observation. And this is used to sort of put together an initial baseline report for, in this case, the city of Tashkent. This gave the background in terms of a description of geographic, social, economic, political, and cultural environment, and a description of the known hazards. And then, in addition to the sort of narrative report, we basically put together a mapping, as it's now referred to, of initiatives and strategies. And each of those organizations that felt that they were doing something in the area of disaster risk reduction to say what it was and give us the highlights of that initiative. And this is what I'm referring to as the plan in practice. These folks actually, had never previously sat down together to fashion a plan and to give any coherence to what they were doing. We're all just doing their own projects in their own silos with whatever resources they could cobble together. But in fact, there were many of these. And once we started to look at our stakeholders as wide-ranging, once we were looking at academic and scientific institutions, professional associations, labor organizations, condominium owners associations, neighborhood councils, student groups, service organizations, and those, it went on and on and on. And so in the city of Tashkent, I think we had something like the initiatives. And that really enriched our understanding of what the potential was for urban disaster risk reduction. Once we started to acknowledge all of those small efforts were taking place within their own context. Then compiled that information and categorized it. So, people saying that they were doing all manner of things, but we would see what was being done in assessment and planning, what was being done in physical and environmental protection, and what was being done in response capacity development, so we could better see the goals. And physical environmental protection, and I think this one fits very nicely with Lee's chart that he showed us at the end. We divided the physical environmental protection up into structural, non-structural, infrastructural, and environmental. And structural, as you might imagine, concerned existing buildings and new construction. Then structural concerned content, machinery, and in the case of Tashkent, of course, we were looking at earthquake hazards, so that takes on special relevance as far as protecting the population within the buildings, as well as protecting critical infrastructure. Infrastructural considers all of the lifeline infrastructure and so forth, and environmental. And we also looked at separately risk skills as well as response provisions. And for each level, micro, meso, and macro. So we would have, in other words, there were 3 parts to the whole report, the meso, and the macro sections of the report. And for each of those levels, we also looked at the strategic parameters. the consistent goals, the norms found locally and how we describe them, the applicable laws and policies for each level, the response of government agencies, and then a modified SWOT analysis with weaknesses and threats and the resources, a delineation of the stakeholders and their possible roles, and it's a cross-reference to the strategies that were already being used. Use that baseline report to survey to the wide-ranging group of these stakeholders and invited these, especially the organizations, to send representatives to the of what was to be an annual 2-day urban disaster risk reduction planning event. When we got there, we broke into the agenda into the spheres of action. So we start off with assessment planning, and then to physical and environmental protection, and then went to risk capacity development. And we broke into smaller groups and reviewed the norms, evaluated the priorities, discussed collaboration, and that led to some formation of action groups across the silos. So it was very interesting. We just allowed people to voluntarily break themselves up into groups. And so we had separate groups meeting on structural safety, non-structural safety, infrastructure safety, and what was my fourth? Let's be back there. And environmental protection, excuse me. And as a result of that discussion and putting all this up in a matrix around the walls of a room, there was a great deal of interest generated in both in sharing, so that people started to recognize where the capacities and strengths already lay and where many initiatives had already begun and things could be expanded, where the expertise in the urban environment lay, and who could go to whom for more support. They all then collectively began to see the gaping holes, and they were able, with different colored pens, to kind of start going around and identifying what that needed to be done. The subsequent session, as people moved around, the participants were able to start prioritizing and highlighting and putting stars next to the things that they thought were the most important activity to be undertaken. That did, opportunity for information sharing, networking, relationship building, cross-sectoral collaboration, developing new initiatives, and also assisting donors and funders in identifying worthwhile and feasible projects, because so much energy generated in the course of this event. It's very clear what kind of synergies were starting to emerge. Theoretically, the next steps would be to have a secretariat for a group like that, or leadership from a consortium or from a municipal demo and so forth, to have ongoing action planning groups, to have a periodic review, and to repeat a meeting like that, say, every couple of years. So I know I've zipped right through that, but hopefully we'll be able to come back in the discussion session to make additional sense of it. But that's really, I think, a process that would be applicable for about any city where comprehensive disaster risk reduction plan had not yet taken place. And it's kind of a combination of a top-down and bottom-up approach. It's an urban application, I would say, of some of our traditional vulnerability and capacity assessment approaches. I also want to mention among our urban stakeholders a group that needs special consideration and some special efforts to include. And at the time that we did the project in Tashkent, I was not as sensitized as I am now to that, and we didn't do a very good job of it. But with child participation, I think that we're doing this for the future. We're doing this for our children, and we have clearly, I think, demonstrated in the last 10 years. The children played an important role in risk reduction and response. They play an important information sharing. They are eager to be involved. They often are provide the energy and the inspiration to get things done. Now with child participation, I think is not as complex as perhaps it sounds. We can mobilize existing school-based, neighborhood-based, and youth groups. There's no need to start a whole new organization. There are many places where children gather. We have to have a whole new activity either. We can join into sporting events and community events and festivals and so on. We do, of course, always want to be transparent and encourage informed consent. We will have opportunities to participate, and when participants have to be limited, we want a transparent and a democratic selection process. Ideally, young people can select their own representatives and do a good job at that. And we also want to make sure that we have some child and youth-oriented introductory sessions so they know what they're getting involved in, and we can tailor it to their needs and understanding. Something we've seen has been very effective as far as child participation is special briefings with municipal leadership. And wherever it's been done, the municipal leadership and policymakers are delighted to input of young people. I think also field trips, speakers, video interviews with a range of stakeholders, HBCA, Town Watch are all very valuable to be used in the urban setting. And of course, wherever possible, facilitating some innovation projects and giving them the kind of prominence that they deserve. So pretty much it in a nutshell. I want to make sure we have time for everybody to discuss the exciting presence. I want to yield the fact to our host.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I see, looking at the questions that I received, that the workshop or the two-day event is generating a lot of energy and enthusiasm. At the end, we will have a number of questions there. I also see that I still have to open my presentation. Is my presentation visible again? Yeah. I also see that I have given very little information in terms of the bios of the different speakers. Do know that more information is available in the program brochure that everyone can download, or that will be made available again after the webinar, so that you can read whatever you want about that person. Again, the third speaker, Daniel Homsi. Daniel is from the city of San Francisco. He's Director of Strategic Initiatives for the city's Administrator's Office. He will talk about community programs, the Empowered Communities program. Build stronger neighborhoods, one decision at a time. Daniel, I will make you the presenter. Share your desktop and open your presentation. We can all enjoy it. Yesterday we had a lot of discussion about community programs and community involvement.
Can you see my presentation now?
Not yet. You have to share your screen.
Okay.
In the top menu under share, you will find.
Here it is. My apologies.
No problem. As long as it take too long, because I don't know any jokes. We see it all, Daniel. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little of the work we're doing here in San Francisco. My name is Daniel Homsi. I work for the City and County of San Francisco, and I have the pleasure and the opportunity to work every day with the amazing communities of the city to hopefully not only help them achieve their goals today, but I'll help them prepare for any opportunities or challenges that may come their way in the future. The program we run is called the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, and I'll dig a little more into it in a few seconds, but I thought perhaps giving a little background as to how we got to where we are today, I think is always important in understanding how you develop initiatives like this and the community around them. In 2007, Mayor Ed Lee led a delegation of city officials to New Orleans after Katrina. And admittedly, when we went down there, we felt that we were sort of going from, sort of San Francisco with its reality down to New Orleans with its own reality, and we're going to try and sort of do the traditional mutual aid to help them recover from Katrina. Upon arrival, and after spending several days down there working with neighborhood leaders, it was really obvious and apparent to us that there was many things that San Francisco could learn from the experiences of the neighborhoods of New Orleans. You see the classic image from the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 in San Francisco, and once you take the water away in New Orleans, you found many of the outputs very similar. That's the Ninth Ward that impacted that city as well. Here's another home in the Ninth Ward that was swept away by a barge that came over the levee wall. And here's another famous image from San Francisco, which is the mansion that burned down and left City Hall in a rumble behind it. But we also found hope, and this is really where the root of our work here in the city has been initiated. Here you see an image of LaToya Cantrell and Hal Rourke presenting their community developed recovery plan that they put together after the disaster in the absence of really any help or support coming from the local government. On the table you see from the right, Sarah Dennis from the Planning Department, Tony Irons from the Public Utilities Commission, and the gentleman with the laptop is Doug Allers from the Harvard Key School, who had gone there and for the last several years has brought down to work side by side with the residents to build community. And with the gentleman with his back to us is the mayor of the city and county of San Francisco, Ed Lee, who is city administrator at the time. And for us, we really were very taken by the fact that neighborhoods really have a huge responsibility in the recovery process. And in essence of that, you frankly do not have a recovery to speak of. Harvard actually has advanced a narrative out there called the tipping factor. And this is the reality. Once the disaster happens, the key stakeholders, which are the taxpayers, the residents, the small business owners, the people who shop in those businesses, they have to make a decision. Are they going to tip in or tip out? The thing driving their decision-making is they're uncertain about how rapid and effective government recovery efforts will be. They're about what local fellow stakeholders will do. Is my neighbor going to stay? Is the business next door going to close? They've witnessed the destruction of many things that they love, fill in the blank, about San Francisco, and those images still burn deeply in the hearts and souls of San Francisco, even though it was just a few generations ago. They stand in the midst of a widespread system collapse. And so once your lifelines go down for any suspended period of time, people really start making some aggressive decisions about where to locate to maintain their lifestyle. So given the impact on property values and the financial burden, a lot of people are financially stressed to a level they've never been before, which puts an undue amount of press on them mentally to make some decisions. And finally, they actually have, true physical, mental impacts that for them is a very intense condition to weather every day in an environment that's been stressed by a disaster. They tip out. Well, the city specifically, if you look at New Orleans, for example, where almost half of the population left, it could have a huge impact on the budget revenue of the city. All in a city like San Francisco, which is a major destination city for companies based on the people that live in San Francisco, we're the highly educated cities in America, having massive evacuation could be a very big problem. Destabilizing our local social capital networks. Anyone who's done any work in looking at response and restoration will tell you that the social capital networks, those relationships at the community level, are vital. And if people start to drop out of those networks that provide vital services and resources to other people, you could have a total systems collapse across the board economically and socially. In other words, San Francisco, believe it or not, could experience a very similar condition as New Orleans that we refer to as New Orleans 2.0. The other is, well, how do we get people to tip in? We know it might drive them to tip out, but more importantly, then, how do we? What's our call to action? Harvard recommends that we need to nurture capable local leadership. We need to train them to drive rapid substantive action. We need to focus on inclusiveness. We need to embrace self-reliance. We need to define the work on a human scale. We need the ability to seek out and interface successfully with other sources of help, and this is that sort of cross-sector alliance that you might say could be top-down. Must be able to evolve and adapt as challenges arrive, and they must be able to develop new skills and capacities. Latoya Cantrell, the young woman in the first photo that you saw of the community work in New Orleans, the day before Katrina, she was a mother of 2 children working jobs, and she has turned around and become probably one of the more talented, successful area planners in New Orleans in the course of recovering from the disaster. So in response to all that, the mayor asked me to leave, actually at the time working for the mayor of the city and county of San Francisco, running a department called the Office of Neighborhood Services. And I was invited to leave that position and come work for the city administrator to advance this program that conceptually would tackle those bold capabilities that Harvard Kennedy School had advanced. And so this is a program now that is being supported by the General Service Agency and the Cisco Department of Emergency Management, and actually part of my salary actually does come from Homeland Security funding to help fund this work. Created something called the Neighborhood Empowerment Network. This is an important initiative that we advanced, and I think what's significant about it is that we didn't hire a marketing firm and then roll out some big press conference and invite the neighborhoods to it. We actually sat down with 50 neighborhood leaders, many of whom are perhaps some of the government-friendly individuals in the city, and put together this vision and strategy in order to ensure the highest level of buy-in and ownership from the neighborhood leadership across San Francisco. The net universe looks like this, and it probably looks like a lot of other cities that everyone else probably lives in. To our left, we have the government branch. We separate the executive and legislative branch just for reference. In San Francisco, we have a strong mayor. The mayor of the city and county of San Francisco is independently elected from the council, if you will. They actually oversee the development of the budget and manage about 40 departments directly. This Thursday, we'll be introducing our city budget at a very reasonable $6.4 billion. So it's not a small task to run San Francisco. Then we actually carve out separately the government agencies, as we also refer to sometimes as the bureaucracy. And it's always important to understand the cultural differences between those two institutions in government and relate to them accordingly. In the center, we have the NGO universe, the non-governmental organizations. This is everything from our faith-based community and nonprofits. And then a piece of that we have our, and of course the private sector, our academic institutions. And our academic institutions we call out uniquely because we really feel they're an incredibly important resource in the work of running our city today and ultimately rebuilding our communities should we need to after some kind of an event. And then to our right we have our neighborhood groups and our residents, and again we split those into two. There are a lot of neighborhood groups in our neighborhoods, but intrinsically not all residents feel like they are a member of those groups, so those groups identify them or represent them. So we ultimately split those two groups out as well, realizing that you must bifurcate your communication strategy and not always flow through these self-assigned organizations. So that's one of the big game changers have been the creation of something called NEN University here in San Francisco. San Francisco is really well known for its tourist business and also its leadership in the sort of technology fields. We have some small companies like Twitter and Salesforce here in San Francisco that call us home. But after looking at the model that was initiated in New Orleans with the Harvard Kennedy School, we realized that we were not tapping into an incredibly valuable resource here in San Francisco, and that was the university community. The three largest players in San Francisco are UCSF, which alone has 28,000 employees. San Francisco State University, which has about 35,000 to 40,000 students and faculty, and then the University of San Francisco, which comes in around 6,000 to 7,000 students and faculty. And they're amazingly important organizations that every day are actually doing service learning and engaged learning in our neighborhoods, helping communities achieve a better condition in a self-assigned basis. And it was that the city had not really ever figured out how to leverage this community in a to achieve both its goals and the community's goals. However, over the last few years, and I'm sure many people on this call can relate, we've been going through some pretty massive budget cuts, and has really made it very difficult for us to continue to invest in the capacity building side of our programs, and to really shifted more into a direct services model, which is fine, but if you believe in the teach a man to fish, give a man a fish model, it's definitely undermines some of the long-term sustainability goals you have for communities. And so NEN University now operationalizes all of these amazing assets in these universities and brings them in a coordinated effort with city programs and assets and nonprofits to make a meaningful difference on a sustained basis with our neighborhoods. The highest level program that comes out of the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, which again, this alliance of nonprofits and faith-based organizations and foundations and city agencies and such, is an asset-based organizing initiative, the Empower Communities program, that supports communities as they leverage hyper-local problem solving to build strong cross-sector working relationships with both local and regional stakeholders on a sustained basis. And the crux of it is that we often go into neighborhoods and have sort of a top-down conversation and kind of let them know what their problems are and let them know what we're going to do to solve them. And what we're really doing is robbing them a chance of achieving those conditions that Harvard laid out, especially the ability to lead, to coordinate, to make decisions, to do so inclusively, and to build functioning, sustained working relationships with organizations outside of their community. And why that's so important, of course, after disaster, when government does shrinking ability to engage residents, if they don't have an alternative network to plug into, really their hands are tied in advancing towards their recovery. So the goal is to also open meaningful conversation with residents to help them understand what is resilience. And I know that term resilience is kind of thrown around a lot lately. Before it was sustainability. We often joke that it's the term that it's the pesto of the 2010s. It's a term that everyone seems to feel very comfortable using when they're describing their work, but really is a very complicated term for the average resident in our head. So we have taken the time to break out resilience into some functional areas. So we understand that there's 8 functional areas to resilience that we present to our communities: economic, infrastructure, public safety, health, emergency management, education, social, cultural, and spiritual, and environmental. And we help them understand that there's actually 3 levels to resilience. We see there's individual resilience, there's organizational resilience, and there's community resilience. All 3 are functionally different but connected and scalable. And that if you live in a community that all the individuals are failing in the economic area, i.e. poor, low employment levels and an inability to open, sustain meaningful small businesses, you can see that scales up and structurally can destabilize the entire community resilience model. But it's not just the functional areas. What we actually want to do, or the operational, is to help people understand what is the functional condition of resilience. And so we've worked with our academic partners and our neighborhood leaders to break out resilience into a functional model, so people really see really about behavior that drives resilience. So again, we look at the individual, organizational, community level, but we break out in 5 sections: financial, governance, communications, research analysis, and outreach. And I feel that at these 3 levels, if a person or an organization cannot manage its money effectively, the community can't govern itself in a way that's inclusive and results-oriented, so that people feel there's truly a universal buy-in on its decisions. Is a weak ability to communicate amongst folks so that they can share and update each other on their goals and dreams. If the community can't really actually make meaningful, deep decisions because it doesn't actually research and secure data and process in a way that helps it make the right decisions first time. And ultimately, if it's able to really organize and plan as a community and really participate in long-term planning processes, going to have a real difficult time, not only succeeding today in the urban planning conversations and economic development conversations that are constantly happening in our neighborhoods across this planet, but also obviously post-disaster, it'll definitely weaken the community's ability to participate in the recovery plan. So, yes, sir.
Okay, so go on.
On the second to last slide here. So in this place, what we do is this is one of the models we use for our neighborhoods. We align all the assets that I articulated earlier. We bring together a group of folks that we feel are committed to the long-term sustainability of the community. We actually leverage our academic assets to do stakeholder interviews with grad students. We do asset mapping. We do an infrastructure assessment of their communication environment. We host summits. We start doing projects. We find that if you want residents to participate in programs like this, you've actually accomplished meaningful things that they care about. It could be planting trees. It could be about putting curb cuts in, whatever they want to do. And thus the stars indicate those projects. And then ultimately, we launched something called a Resilience Council, which I think earlier someone touched on a forum in England. This is what we do in our neighborhoods here in the city, is we're advancing these cross-sector groups that are neighborhood-based. As you can see, the collective set of folks in here from inside and outside the neighborhood working side by side, stewarding the community towards their success on a daily basis, perpetually, so that the event comes together. These people don't meet for the first time in a community room talking about ways ahead of them. To close, we talk about going back to the future again. There's a lot of wonderful things that have happened in New Orleans. This is a local school that the City and County of San Francisco helped nurture the recovery of. Today it's a Green Building Council LEED standard school in the middle of the community, housing now 450 children. You can see the hallways of this place were pretty spooky the day we were there. Now they're gorgeously lit with bamboo floors and fluorescent lighting. And throughout the whole experience, you can see that this building sort of symbolizes what many people came to see as a condition of New Orleans. And it's really exciting to go back today and see a place full of light and joy. And in the end, to touch on the remarks from the Save the Children person is that, and it comes down to these folks right here who maybe were just 1 or 2 years old during the Katrina and now are about to inherit the city and get it back together. In the Communities program, we're building stronger communities one decision at a time. And thank you all for your time today.
My compliments. It's good to hear you talk about people and behavior instead of rules and institutions. It's all that tremendous amount of energy. And
thank you, sir.
It was difficult today that you have to stop. If you can stop your presentation and stop sharing your screen, I'll take over.
Here it comes.
Not yet. You still have to. This is it. If you make me the next presenter, I am the presenter. I'll share my desktop and show you my slides. Thanks very much, Neil. I saw a couple of questions coming in. They come later. We go to our final speaker, Professor Rohit Yikyasu, Research Center for Disaster Mitigation of Urban Cultural Heritage at a university in Japan. How do I pronounce that? Ritsumeikan University. We'll talk about reducing risk to urban cultural heritage through engagement of multiple stakeholders. And stop sharing my screen and make it Rohit.
Moment.
Okay.
I'm just gonna share my screen now.
Yep.
Yes.
We all sound like very experienced presenters with this WebEx technology.
Okay, so I hope everyone can hear me clearly.
Excellent.
Perfect. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present on an aspect of cities which we generally ignore, and that is cultural heritage. So the title I have given to my presentation is Reducing Risks to Urban Cultural Heritage Through Engagement of Multiple Stakeholders. Now, first of all, let's look at what do we mean by cultural heritage in urban context. I'm only talking about just monuments protected by fences or with gates, or are we talking about traditional neighborhoods which are dynamic, where residents are living and for generations, and which is part of their day-to-day living? It's really a living and dynamic urban context that we are talking about, both with its tangible as well as intangible manifestations, really contribute towards identity and resilience, and that is something that needs to be protected against natural disasters or even those which are caused by humans. Now, if we look at the reality of heritage, if we see only the monuments, we forget about the context within which these monuments are located, we actually don't understand their reality. The reality of this monument is not just this photograph, but it is reality which is around this monument. So what does that mean? It means that these heritage structures have got a contemporary relationship to the inhabitants in urban surroundings. So we can't just deal with these monuments without really without really taking into consideration the context which is determined by people who are living around these. What are we talking about when we really talk of heritage in an urban context? We are talking about historical landscapes where we cannot isolate monuments, we cannot isolate traditional housing from other components. We are actually looking at cities in relationship to their ecological and environmental relationship to the surroundings, the peri-urban areas, the rural areas, the dynamic interrelationship that has actually contributed to survival and growth and evolution of these cities. This is what we need to protect, and ironically, because this chaos, this relationship being affected by many factors, are we actually becoming more vulnerable to disasters? So from this point of view, I'm addressing this whole issue of protecting urban heritage and engaging multiple stakeholders. Now look at what happens to heritage as a result of disasters. We have plenty of examples where heritage has really been impacted very adversely because of many natural as well as human-induced factors. Now, we have an example of floods in Bangkok, which were really devastating, and not only they caused a lot of damage to human lives and the properties, but they also affected very important heritage sites which were located right in the middle of urban environment. Take example Bangkok or even Ayutthaya, which is a World Heritage Site. It's a town which has this archaeological site in the midst of its new development, and it was really adversely affected because of these floods. Now, we also have other examples. For example, look at Rome, which had experienced floods in 2008, and St. Peter's Cathedral and all the surroundings were also very, very badly affected. We have example of floods in Hanoi, Vietnam. Now, of course, the entire urban area was flooded. But what happened as a result of that was the archaeological sites, which were located right in the middle of the city, were really adversely affected because of the change in the topography. Of course, archaeological sites are very much below ground, and because of the improper drainage, a lot of waterlogging happened, which caused immense damage to this heritage. There's an example of other kinds of disasters, and we have a very classic case of fire in the historic district of Edinburgh in 2002, and this is in fact a heritage city, and the impact of fire has been irreplaceable because what has been lost is very difficult to get back. So we're facing these immense issues of our vulnerable urban heritage, and which is in fact becoming increasingly vulnerable now with climate change and issues like global terrorism, which is making it even more vulnerable. We have also example from India where historic town of Bhuj was very badly damaged after 2001 earthquake. Now, what does the question I want to pose here is whether we are only concerned about the physical parts of heritage, or is it something more than that? And I would like to mention here that we are in fact not just talking about built heritage. What we are really concerned about are people's safety, because of course this is a living heritage. People are living there. Talking about social change. In many cases, the community profile has changed because of immigration because of changing population densities. The communities which have been living for generations have now moved out, or new people have come in, and of course they have very different relationship to the physical heritage. So there's another kind of impact that one sees. And of course, loss of economy and livelihoods. So one sees, when one in fact understands the impact on urban heritage, it is very difficult to isolate just monuments on just physical form, fabric, from all these different factors that have to be accounted for if we have to make our heritage protected from disasters. So urban cultural heritage, especially the ones which are unprotected and unrecognized, like housing or those humble parts of heritage, are much more vulnerable to disasters. Now, some issues regarding vulnerability of these urban cultural heritage. First issue that I want to focus is that we tend to always look upon either earthquake or flooding or fire, but when we look at historic urban areas, especially when they are part of a larger urban environment, we are in fact talking about multiple hazards. For example, the case of Kobe, where there was not just earthquake, but the entire historic urban neighborhood was damaged because of fire, because there were wooden houses, and when earthquake shook these buildings, there were electric short circuits, which caused really damage to a large part of the very historic neighborhood of this city. We are also not just talking about fire or issues related to the sites themselves. Sometimes the risks are coming from the surroundings. Take example of Kathmandu Valley, where the heritage site is in fact not just this ensemble, but it's surrounded by a very dense urban fabric. And what is happening is, of course, the heritage site, which is designated as World Heritage, is protected, but there are hardly any controls or regulations in the surroundings of this World Heritage site. So what's happening? These kinds of transformations are taking place in urban surroundings, which are in fact highly vulnerable to earthquakes. This is in fact one of the most vulnerable area to earthquakes, and we are expecting a big earthquake in very near future. So you can understand what will happen in case an earthquake was to strike this area. All the access routes to this important site would be blocked, and people who would be, lots of visitors are there in these heritage sites, and they will be just blocked there, and they would not be able to move out while the emergency services cannot come in. So we are facing this huge issue, which we just can't resolve by having only heritage managers talk about risk reduction. We have to engage the context of these heritage sites, which means many other stakeholders. I'll come to this issue later. Also, this I think has been talked about yesterday, but I want to highlight that a related issue of easing disaster vulnerability is also loss of traditional urban boundaries. That is in fact creating much more vulnerability, because delicate ecological relationships have been destroyed and is beyond repair, and these are making them much more vulnerable to, for example, flooding. Urban heritage, as I mentioned before, has a contemporary relationship to people's lives and livelihoods, and we have to really take this into account, especially in developing countries, especially in those contexts where cities are dynamically evolving. On one hand, we have under tremendous pressure. But on another hand, we also have many historic towns and historic urban areas which have been, in fact, been abandoned. So see, these are important buildings which are part of a very historic cities, but there is nobody to live there, because there are no livelihood opportunities available. So people have moved out, and this heritage is getting dilapidated because there is nobody to take care of them. I have to summarize these vulnerability issues. In fact, it is not just an issue of looking at heritage in isolation. It is about connecting heritage to issues that really affect urban areas today, especially in developing countries, which are of poverty, lack of livelihood opportunities, governance, social inequity, traditional skills and capacities. And I would like to mention here that, in fact, a lot of heritage buildings, heritage planning, the way historically cities have been planned, have a lot of lessons for us to kind of capture in terms of disaster mitigation, because people have really evolved these through the experience over time. And I already mentioned that there is also of traditional ecological relationships. So, in fact, if we have to reduce vulnerabilities of cities, a lot of connections with heritage in terms of what we can learn in traditional resilience mechanisms that have been evolved by the communities. And, of course, it is also important to understand that a lot of our heritage is, in fact, surviving because of people who are poor. So, on one hand, they are vulnerable, but on the other hand, they are the ones who are keeping this heritage. So, the other issue that we face in case of urban heritage after disasters is insensitive demolition. And here there is the issue of lack of coordination between stakeholders, because a lot of heritage buildings which are of very significance are just pulled down because the rescue agencies who come in are not sensitive, or they are even aware of the values of these heritage structures in urban areas. And so we find that a lot of historic cities are just cleared out, or they are just made. The entire spaces are cleaned up just in the name of safety. This is another issue that is very much there. Now,
may I ask you,
yes. So what we are going to look at are different stakeholders. On one hand, we have heritage sector, which has the stakeholders like communities, trusts, private owners, or agencies of culture. On the other hand, we have urban development sector, which has stakeholders or departments which are from environment, services, land use planning, housing, public transport. Of course, we have disaster management sector that has civic defense, NGOs, communities, municipalities. Now, the challenge is lack of coordination between these three main sectors and different stakeholders that are there. So I'm going to conclude here by really saying that what we are trying to do as part of our university in our training course, and also as our pilot projects, is to work towards developing integrated urban disaster risk reduction, which is taking into account multiple hazards and vulnerabilities, and actually tries to mainstream heritage into risk reduction for cities. And they're trying to really pull together 4 of these important sectors that are stated, but we need to pull them together, namely urban development, emergency management, disaster risk reduction, and heritage conservation and management. So on one hand, we are talking about including cultural heritage needs into urban development policies. On the other hand, we are talking about how do we have cultural heritage managers coordinate with urban development agencies. When we do training, our exercises, we find that there is complete lack of even the basic coordination, basic knowledge about the institutions that are there, which have to be really working together in order to reduce risks. So I will conclude with this last slide by emphasizing this, which we really do in our courses, in our pilot activities, that if we have to do disaster risk management for cultural heritage properties, we have to connect them on one hand with management systems for heritage properties that are already existing, which means thinking about maintenance and monitoring, and on the other hand, to link them with disaster or crisis management systems for urban or regional regions within which these sites are located. It needs a multidisciplinary approach, and we need to understand the vocabulary that is used by cultural heritage development and disaster risk reduction sectors. So this from there I'd like to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohit. It's good to see that cultural heritage is not about the one beautiful building, but also about its neighborhood and their people. And I know it's a complicated process. That's what you're emphasizing. It requires an integrated approach. If you are sharing your screen, I will take over. If you make me the presenter again. Which I now am. I thank you very much. Are about 50 minutes behind schedule. I did stop for in themselves very excellent, very stimulating presentation. That's why I had them run a couple of minutes over time. Questions. I received a number of questions that are related to the different speakers, and I will read them in the order of the presentations. In other words, starting with the questions addressed to Lee. A question from Helena Molin-Valdes, the Deputy Director of the Secretary for the ISDR. How those local governments have actually applied those local resilience forums? They are in regulations, but it is about 10 cities in the UK or hundreds and hundreds of cities. And how is this stimulated or supported at the national level? Lee?
Okay, thanks a lot, Wim, and thanks for your question, Helena. Well, basically, because it's enshrined as a legal requirement, as soon as the Act was out, there was a little bit of slack, but basically all local authorities, local councils needed to put mechanisms in place where these local resilience forums were initiated. And some local authorities were more effective at getting those things into press than others. But obviously this was back when things actually started working, was back in 2005 and moving onwards. Where we are now, basically every local authority, every local council, basically if there's a police constabulary area, then there'll be a local resilience forum. The positives of that basically is that there's been they've actually facilitated a lot more joined up thinking, and there's a range of good examples coming out of where people have sat round the table, proactively discussed ideas and been able to nick any potential problems in the book. There's also been generally a better appreciation of the sort of social and community level issues. Again, this works better in some areas than others. But what is I think there's generally, and a lot of people would agree, there's been generally an increase in the decision-making power to the local stakeholders. This is the positives. There have been some negatives, and that's things like there has been patchy effectiveness of the local resilience forums, although things have got a lot better. From the emergency planners that I spoke to, that can be down to personalities, the personalities that are running or chairing the forum, whether they're given the time to actually take on those responsibilities, what their professional backgrounds are. I mean, if they're from the police forces, or if they used to be in the armed forces, for example, and they're chairing the local resilience forum, then their approach to dealing with the issues may be different to someone who perhaps has gone to university and trained and qualified to be an emergency planner. So their perspectives might be slightly different. And all just to sort of finish off, in some cases, some of the local resilience forums, possibly due to financial constraints, have been a lot more focused on the response, which is a lot more prominent in the Act than the sort of proactive hazard mitigation. What can we actually do in advance to minimise the impacts, or even get rid of chance of floods happening or any security issues? So there's positives and negatives in the way that the local resilience forums have been applied. In essence, they're all up and been operating for a few years now.
Okay, one follow-up question on the possibility to be proactive. Can a forum like that be proactive? If it poses a risk, can it proactively, let's say, contact local governments? Can it stop, for example, local project development if they see that to be a risk?
In theory, yes. And in some cases this has happened, but in practice there can be a number of obstacles. What's key expecting is that the local planners are engaged in this process, because they can be an effective mechanism in, for example, give green light or the red light to a new development being approved or not. If the local planners have sort of brought on board and they sort of say, yes, you can do that if you incorporate some flood resilience, for example, if they're talking about a housing development in a flood-prone area, then that's the sort of way forward. But obviously those things don't always happen in reality. So effective implementation has been patchy, but potentially there's a lot of opportunity for this proactive action and the inputs of a wide range of construction-related professionals within that process as well.
Okay, thanks. It was a question then by, if I pronounce that right, Metron Senol Balaban. I have two more, one from Claudia Gonzalez Musio. If this forum has been established, does it then exist and work permanently or only when needed?
Question for me?
Yes, sir.
Yep, okay. You meet regularly because it's about not just predicting what might happen. For example, it might be a case, one of the local resilience forums that I went to in Nottingham, which is a local town to where I'm based at Loughborough, there were some big events, sports events occurring. So I think the hockey team were playing, there were some big football matches, and also there was some protest marches occurring. And also I think there was a big, the local fighter was, boxer was having a boxing match. So they see these things in advance, 2 or 3 months in advance, and then they convene these meetings. Even when these sorts of things don't happen, I think they still meet basically just to, if it's just to discuss maybe some events that might have occurred which weren't on their radar.
Thanks very much. Lee, be prepared for a question I have for all 4 speakers at the very end for 1-minute answers. What's your, let's say, recommendation in terms of research priorities for the global research community, talking about those local initiatives and how research can support things? Be prepared for that. I have one question for Mila Petal. Question from, again, Helena Molin-Valdes. On those 2-day workshops, where are those actually applied? And is there, and that's my follow-up question, a publication available on experiences with those workshops?
Yes, okay. They were applied in Tashkent, Dushanbe, and Almaty. And there is a report. It was part of the prevention database, which is currently online. So, but I'm happy to dig that up and provide that. So the reports for each of the baseline reports are also available. Those are now about 8 years old or so. And I don't think that they were formally kept up, unfortunately, by the authorities to be. But I think that was well before the UNISDR initiative on disaster resilient cities. So I think perhaps we were just a little bit ahead of our time.
If you provide us, the CIB Secretariat, with a report, a shorter document that you want us to make available to all the people who later on will visit the recordings of this, just send it to us and we'll have it included somehow. One more question.
Thank you.
One question also from Helena. Were there budget allocations for workshops like this from local or regional or national government? Who pays for this? How much? What are the practicalities there?
Well, that particular project was funded by USAID. It was an urban earthquake risk reduction initiative in 3 cities in Central Asia. It was fairly modestly funded, and I think that the research that went into developing baseline study for the stakeholders was probably about a 6-month local effort supported by a consultant for about a month in each case. And the workshop itself was very low cost to hold. We held it in a hotel with several breakout meeting rooms. And we got quite a bit of support from local holders as far as, for a good cause. So I don't think that the meeting itself cost $10,000 to hold. But it was, of course, funded externally. And, it's interesting. It's always, I think, important that especially when international donors are involved, that we don't events that are so out of scale to local capacity that the next one seems to be a big letdown. So we tried to sort of follow a model whereby, we served a traditional local lunch, and the incentive for coming was, to really be proactively involved, not to have, 3 meals at a hotel.
Okay, thanks. I think that many people see a potential in having a, let's say, well-modeled 2-day event that aligns with local issues, with local culture, where you raise awareness and break down barriers. Those are the things that were in my memory after I listened to you. Not just as an incidental thing, but something that can be applied in many situations in small and local communities. But maybe your publication that will give some insight in that. Thank you for those answers, and also be prepared for that 1-minute question on research priorities.
May I mention just one other thing, which is that the organizers of the event, after the first day, they really expected that attendance on the second day would go plummeting down. And when we continued to have 90 people at the Tashkent event on the second day, I think basically it impressed everybody to recognize that people weren't just coming out of curiosity; they were coming out of commitment. So let's not underestimate the excitement that can be generated.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. I have a question for Daniel. Daniel, there seems to be a number of people impressed with the enthusiasm, the energy of that approach. The real inclusive thinking is a terminology I read a couple of times. And then they ask, is San Francisco unique in this? Is it leading the way in the U.S. or just one of the many examples?
I think San Francisco historically, just because we have such a huge identity connected to disaster and recovery, I would submit that perhaps we embrace it more as part of our identity. Symbol of our city on our city flag is a phoenix because of our historical relationship with having to come back time and time again. But I do think that there's important work happening everywhere across the country. I think the thing that is the big conversation right now in the United States is not only the importance of resilience, but how do you generate resilience in the different communities that we have? We just released a National Disaster Recovery Framework document, and now there's sort of some implementation strategies being developed. And what's coming out of it is the difference between with all communities, cities of maybe 10 to 15, 20,000 people, and cities like San Francisco, which we have 120 neighborhoods in San Francisco, each of which is like a small town, and with its own diverse culture, priorities, goals, risk assessments. Some neighborhoods are on top of hills that might lose their lifelines in a disaster. Other neighborhoods are on top of old lakes in the city, which are going to deal with massive liquefaction. And the complexity of engaging all these different communities in a meaningful conversation to do the risk assessment and then ultimately design a path forward to predict and prepare for it is a very complicated strategy that we're trying to craft here. So, I think that this is a relatively new field. I know Harvard, through the Acting in Time initiative, is trying to capture this work that's happening around the country and the world. I'm just honored to be at the table and having an opportunity to share it with everybody.
Thank you, Daniel. Also be prepared for my last 1-minute question. I have 2 incoming questions for Rohit. One from Jelly Mooring and one from Claudia Gonzalez Musio again, and they are strongly relating. What good practices are being done to improve resilience in heritage housing and building? And 2, can you mention good examples of integration of cultural heritage management to urban planning and disaster management? So practice and examples.
So I would like to mention, in fact, they are both connected questions. So what we have started to do is we have started to prepare a risk management plan for walled city of Ahmedabad, which is in the western part of India. And we have already, actually the first thing that we have done is to bring together the local municipality, the local municipality as well as the site managers, the heritage managers, as well as the local community together, and we have started to see how in the existing master plan we can include heritage concerns which were not reflected. Although we had prepared a disaster risk management plan after the earthquake in 2001, heritage was not even identified. So we have started by documenting that, engaging these different stakeholders, and then trying to initiate a kind of an action plan. The second example I would like to mention is also from India, and it is of a palace in one of the cities called Udaipur, where in fact is a palace which is located right next to the lake and surrounded by historic city, where the access to the museum was so poor that there was no contact between the local officer and the local police, and they didn't even know which is the shortest route to come there. So we did drills, we did training with the private museum staff, and what we found was that after drills, the local manager of the museum became so interested that they put in place an entire plan of coordination with the emergency services of the city as well as the local staff. So this is the second. The third example I would like to mention is from Japan, from Kyoto, where of course Japanese are very, very much concerned about disaster risk reduction because they're confronted with so many disasters. But for Kyoto, for all the World Heritage sites which are located within the city, they have prepared a disaster risk management plan for individual sites as well as for the entire city. Heritage has been exclusively identified. And it is one very special case where in the fire office of the city, the Kyoto municipality, the special division which is looking at the cultural heritage and has connections or which has links with all managers of sites within Kyoto city. And they do regular exercises, they do regular drills. In fact, they have a very special day on 26th January, which is they have commemorated for heritage risk management. So these are just few examples where, in fact, and then I would also mention that one of the World Heritage sites, they have started a pilot project of engaging local community to the first responders for heritage in their locality. So they are the ones who will come and help out for if in case any disaster happens. So these are a few examples that I'd like to mention.
Thank you much, Rohit. If you want to make a short publication with examples available to the attendees, send it to us and we'll make it available somehow. I thank you very much.
That would be nice.
For the last 4 minutes for each speaker, I want in a few words your recommendation for the absolute top priority for research worldwide in support of what you're doing. Lee, your priorities.
Thanks, Wim. My priorities are actually related to what a lot of the speakers have said, not just today, but yesterday as well. And it might sound a bit obvious, but we still haven't done a very good job of doing it, and that is identifying the good practice, and not just identifying the good practice in DRR, but doing it from specific perspectives of different stakeholders. It's clear there's lots of different stakeholders. They have lots of different agendas. They use different languages. And I think we need to identify the good practice. In some cases, people might be doing things that are good and not even realize that it's related to, for example, resilience building or disaster risk reduction. So I think we'd put a mechanism in place. And this is as much from a construction perspective as a non-construction perspective. What are people doing that is good, and how can we capture that and relate it to other people who are doing similar types of work elsewhere? So that's one point. The other one is perhaps more academic, and that's related to sustainability agenda and the resilience agendas. The 80s and early 90s, if you talk to people about the green agenda and sustainability, particularly in construction, a lot of people would have laughed me out of their offices. But now it's gathered momentum, it's gathered acceptance. And I wondered if we might be missing a trick when we talk about resilience, actually making a point of linking resilience to sustainability a lot more, because from what I can see of resilience, whether you're talking about the way we build things or the way that communities manage and self-organise and make themselves and develop coping strategies, I think that is all, those resilience measures are all pointing towards longer-term sustainable development. So I think we need to link the resilience with the sustainability a lot more than we do, and maybe to find examples of how that happens.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lee. Margaret, what are your priority recommendations for research?
Well, I'm going to go for a very practical one, which is I think that I'd like to see us linking the Safe Schools and Hospitals with the urban risk reduction and the prior Safe Schools campaigns. And I'd like to see us find out whether every new school being built could be a safe school. The reason I say that is that if we were to start the universal, namely schools, that everybody, hopefully almost everybody attends, and if every new school were to be a safe school, within 50 years we would have largely made sure that almost the entire world population attended safe schools. And if we were to use the construction of those schools as an opportunity to teach disaster-resilient construction, we would have ripple effects on construction throughout societies. So I would like to find out whether we can get all those who build schools make the ethical commitments to building every new school a safe school, and find out how to do a due diligence process, sampling to see if we're achieving those outcomes, and really upping the ante so that by 2015 we could actually say that we have evidence and where the gaps are in the construction of new safe schools. Because if what's going on now is, as we suspect, is that every new school is not a safe school, we may be reproducing our problems faster than we're solving them. I'd like to see us just turn a corner on one key issue and see they're actually getting ahead of the problem.
Exactly. Stimulating. Thank you very much, Marla. Daniel, do you have a prime recommendation for world research?
Well, I want to compliment the direction that UNISDR is taking, which is absolutely consistent with much of the conversations that we're having within our sort of now community around really moving the needle on resilience, and that is the strong focus on the roles that mayors and city managers play through all phases of disasters. And I just want to salute the fact that the UN is pushing this down this low, because all the decisions regarding land use and transportation and planning and economic development, the things that really go into making a city resilient, are intensely influenced by the local leadership and the decisions they make regarding governance model, their charters, taxations, and planning and building codes. I just think that that's a really significant effort I actually wanted just to endorse. I think the thing that, in the end, I think what I would like to try and advance for folks is once you get past the folks that lean forward on the issue of disasters, and I think everybody on this call falls into that category, it's hard that next round of crucial stakeholders to come to the table and talk about things that, like, earthquake could happen in 30 years, so we should get ready. And really figuring out how to reframe the conversation and reframe what is the definition of being prepared and resilient, so that people can see how it connects to their day-to-day lives and how it's really about, a perpetual condition and not something that one day may pay off. And that conversation and the search around, the indicators that help people see that, and I think largely focusing on economic indicators. Communities that are succeeding economically generally are perceived as being more resilient in the face of disasters for a myriad of reasons. So it's just helping advance that conversation so that we don't appear to be so wrapped around the axle around the big B, if you will, and move the focus more around big E's and small E's, so that people can see that there is more going on here than just talking about something that could happen someday.
Thank you very much, Daniel. A last 1-minute answer, Rohit. What would your recommendation be for the world research community?
Two things that I would like to propose. The first thing, which I believe strongly, and I have a lot of evidence from my own work, is that we need to actually document traditional management systems by which communities have actually managed risks to their urban environment. We have some lessons, but I think we still need to do a lot more research and a lot more. We need to bring out publication which really brings this out as to how traditional ways of managing, building, have actually contributed towards the disaster risk reduction of urban environments. Second thing is related to this, and that's about documenting, which was also mentioned by one of the participants, is about documenting good practices, because there are practices which are existing but at different levels. And what we need to do is to what works where and at what level, and what are the reasons which drive that success. We need to really understand those factors that lead to the success of initiatives, and so that these can become examples for others to follow, or to at least get inspiration. So I think these are the two things which we really need to work more on, and we need to really disseminate also in a proper way. One of the things which is connected to this is to have good tools available for making risk assessment, for prioritizing actions, and to be able to take immediate measures. So we also need to really work on some tools and methodologies for undertaking such things.
Okay, thank you very much. Those were 4 related but very different answers. We'll take them into account when defining the research roadmap that we will publish and make available to all. I'm an expert myself on resilience, but I have my general interest. I found a lot of stimulation in all of the 4 presentations, and I want to compliment all of our 4 speakers. You know that the next webinar is tomorrow. It will take place 1 hour earlier than this one. It will be in Spanish. That's Thursday. Friday we will have the 4th and last one. That will start at the same time as today again, and that will be focusing on the experience with a local self-assessment tool in 5 different cities from all over the world. So very much practice experiences with the ISDR tools. I thank you all very much. I enjoyed my webinar. I hope you did. I hope to see you again, meet you again online tomorrow or day after for the 3rd and or the 5th seminar. I thank you very much. Bye to all.
Thank you.
Thanks. And also particularly wanted to just say very quickly, thanks Marla, Daniel and Rohit for joining me with this webinar, and particularly Rohit at quite short notice as well. So thank you. I found your presentations and really interesting, and look forward to following them up individually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Bye.